Welcome to the Stephen Mansfield audio podcast.
I have to confess that I love the shows that come at the end of every year that, tell us the 10 trends of this, or the 10 biggest moments of the year, or the 20 most popular this and that of the year. I like those kinds of shows. I like somehow being able to get my mind around what's happened in a given year. And I also get moved, by the way, at those countdowns or those listings of people who have passed away in the previous year. I love all of that kind of stuff. And so I assembled a list of my own, and I'm calling it the 10 Faith Trends of 2011. I like paying attention to faith and how it's shaping our society and shaping our times. And I'm very, very intrigued by all that's happened in 2011, especially from a faith perspective. So I'm calling this talk 10 Faith Trends of 2011. Let me get right to them. One of the most important, and so the one I made number one in this list is something I've already spoken about in my podcasts, and that is our Mormon moment in America. I don't think there's any question that the fact that Mormons have achieved such prominence is an absolutely astonishing faith trend in American history and also in 2011. You can imagine what I would be referring to. That Mitt Romney is one of the lead contenders for the Republican nomination for president. As a Mormon, that Glenn Beck is one of the leading broadcasters, that the top play on Broadway is the Book of Mormon, that the woman who wrote the Twilight series, Stephanie Myers, is a Mormon, that you have 13 Mormons in Congress, both the House and the Senate. I could just go on and on and on with all of the symbols of the fact that Mormons have not just reached acceptance, but prominence. You have Brigham Young University, and you have the Stephen Covey management tools, and it just goes on forever. And so I think that one of the major trends, one of the major defining religious trends of our time is the ascent of Mormonism. And I'm going to come back to something about them before I'm finished with this list of 10. The second most important faith trend or faith happening of 2011, I believe, is the Arab Spring. And to understand the Arab Spring, you really need to understand something that I'm always emphasizing, but I know people's eyes roll back in their heads when they hear me say the word, and that's demographics. The fact is that there is a demographic shift happening in the world, and it is directly responsible for the Arab Spring. Now, we all know what the Arab Spring was. It was when people's movements in various Middle Eastern countries, usually dominated by an old secular or Islamic guard, people's movements arose against the old guard, and there was something of a democratic uprising, an expression, an overthrow of government. Well, this happened largely because of that force that folks get tired of talking about or thinking about, but which is a massive force in our society and in our world, and that is demographics. In Egypt, for example, the average age, the mean age in Egypt is 24. Well, that explains a great deal why a young tribe is arising against the old guard, the Mubaraks, and throwing them out of power. That young tribe is internet-oriented, Facebook-oriented. Yes, maybe they want to identify with their Muslim faith, but they want to do it in a new way that allows them to have Christian friends and connect with the West and so on. And so the fact that the average age in Egypt is 24 had a huge amount to do with the Arab Spring. The fact that the average age in Iraq is 20 is also huge and is going to portend huge things for that country. In fact, I was in the Philippines not long ago. The average age there is 22. These are unbelievably young average ages, and of course it's going to mean massive social change and political change for the country. By contrast, by example, the average age in the United States is 38, and the average age in England and the UK is 40. So this tells you a great deal about what's happening and a great deal about what caused the Arab Spring. And I think this is just huge as a force in the world, particularly in the area of religion. Number 3, believe it or not, is also about the Arab Spring, because even though you have a young tribe rising against the older oppressors, the fact is that it's my view that old Muslim forces have kidnapped the Arab Spring. If you look at the main countries where the Arab Spring took place and where it's happening now, a force called the Muslim Brotherhood has moved in, is winning elections, has pretty much captured the revolution. This is happening all throughout the Middle East, wherever an assumed democracy sort of raised its head. And so keep your eye on this. This is very, very important. Obviously, we in the West love democratic uprisings. We love power to the people. We love seeing the young arise and cast off the carcass of an older generation's oppression. But sometimes this just destabilizes a country and allows evil forces, I would call them, or insidious forces to move in and to do harm. And I believe what's happening in 3 or 4 Muslim countries is that the Muslim Brotherhood is kidnapping the revolution. That's number 3, and that's pretty important. Number 4, I think, is also important, and that is that the Pew Forum, not at all a conservative think tank or study group, has actually used the phrase pro-life America, because now about 56% of Americans believe that the child in the womb is a human being during the entire of the 9 months and ought not to be taken without that, of course, being murder. So they've used the phrase pro-life America. For the first time since Roe v. Wade in 1973, a vast majority of Americans believe that the child in the womb is a human life and ought to be protected. That's a massive trend. It's gaining force. It's gaining force not just for religious and philosophical reasons, but is also gaining force because of technology and ultrasound machines and the way that a younger generation is being convinced by ultrasound photographs. So keep that in mind. That's going to really change our politics and the course of our nation. Number 5 has to do with the informalization of American Christianity. I've made that word up. The idea that American Christianity, and Christianity is still very much the dominant religion in America, is becoming much less institutional, much less formal. For example, adult attendance of church in America is down approximately 10%. Adult attendance of Sunday school is down approximately 10%. Also, church volunteerism is down approximately 10%. It just so happens that all of those categories are either side of 10%. But the number of people claiming to be born again in America is up about 16%, much higher than it has been in decades. So religion, according to these surveys that I'm citing and others, is more important to Americans than ever, and yet many of them are disassociating from the institutions of religion. Well, that's got its good side, it's got its bad side, but there's no question that that is a massive trend in American society. And those who look at church attendance and church giving and so on as the sole measure of American religion are going to miss the fact that Americans are simply becoming more informal about their religion, but they're becoming more passionate about religion. Number 6 is something I'm calling the Rob Bell factor. And it's the fact that a person can arise on the national scene in the United States, proclaim something completely contrary to the gospel of Jesus, and the churches hardly make a sound. I think this is a trend. It portends something that's not necessarily positive if you are an evangelical like I am. But even if you're not, even if you're just an observer of American religious trends, what we know is that the American churches are not very doctrinally oriented. They are not going to man the ramparts of their doctrinal forts and their doctrinal, military facilities, so to speak, of their doctrinal structures. Very few came out in opposition to Rob Bell, and yet Rob Bell was saying things about the teachings of Jesus and what happens in an afterlife that have been at the core of Christianity for ever since, of course, the first creeds were devised. So this is a factor that's going to continue to plague us, I believe, continue to be an issue, and it's also going to be a factor in American culture and politics. Number 7 is a very interesting trend, and I won't bore you with all the statistics, but let me say it this way. Throughout most of American religion, in fact, and throughout most of world Christianity, there's been a tension between the mystic and the reformer. The mystic just wanted to know God, be in his presence, pray, have prayer meetings, have Bible studies, things of that nature. The reformer wanted to take an impetus from the love of God and Scripture and so on and go and change society. What's interesting is that statistically, the young, the millennials, are perfectly merging that dichotomy into one. No longer with that generation do you have the difference between the mystic and the reformer. Instead, you have them merged. So yes, they want to have spiritual experiences. Yes, the 20-somethings want to know God, have encounters, hear his voice, know his leading, know his impressions, feel things. But they also insist that true religion is making a difference in the real world. And I think that's going to be a marvelous trend, but it certainly is not the way their parents thought. Number 8 is the result also of a Pew Forum study, and it has to do with religious knowledge. The Pew Forum does a marvelous job scanning religious knowledge, and it was very interesting. In a survey they've done of late, it was found that atheists and agnostics know more about religion than any other group. Jews are second in that list. White evangelical Protestants are third in that list. And then finally you get down to Catholics and mainline Protestants, and then frankly nothing in particular is one of the categories under mainline Protestants. So actually, by the way, I left somebody out. It's atheists, Jews, then Mormons, and then white evangelical Protestants. Well, when this list came out, evangelicals just went crazy to find that Mormons, Jews, and atheists knew more about religion than they did. But it was embarrassing what evangelicals could not answer about their own faith. In fact, Protestants in general did horribly. In fact, 53% of Protestants could not identify who Martin Luther was. Now, just in case you don't know, Martin Luther was the man who inspired the Protestant Reformation and therefore created the whole Protestant movement, along with people like John Calvin. So the idea that more than half of Protestants can't name the founder of their movement is tragic. So we're dealing with, especially in the Christian world, a horrible loss of knowledge. And I think it was unbelievably convicting to a lot of evangelical Christians who pride themselves on their knowledge of their faith and the scriptures, that atheists, Jews, Mormons all know more than they do, even, by the way, about their own faith. There's number 9 is the interesting trend in religions. And by the way, the last 2 in my list really deal with certain assumptions and myths that are floating around the world, especially in the United States. Many people, for example, assume that Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world. It's not. There's absolutely no question that Christianity is the fastest growing religion in the world. It increased in 2011 by 6.9%. Now, the second fastest growing religious segment in the world, believe it or not, is what's called non-religious. This would be atheists, people who identify themselves as secular humanists, or people who just have no religious preference whatsoever. So the fastest growing by far is 6.9% Christians. The second is secular, non-religious, some broad category like that. Then Muslims are increasing at 2.7% a year. And by the way, the vast majority of that is birth rates. Hindus are next, not Mormons, but Hindus are next at 2.3%. And then the Pew Forum has a category called nominal Christians. I think that means sort of mainline Protestant and Catholic. That would be 2.2%. And then finally, at the bottom of this brief list is the Buddhists, who are growing at 1.7%. So the growth patterns are much, much different than most people believe. Most people, especially in the West, believe that Islam is growing dramatically in the world. Well, it's only 2.7%, and most of that's by birth rates. But Christianity is growing by 6.9%. By the way, most of that is by conversion, since most of the current Christian world is actually decreasing in its population. And then finally, number 10 has to do with some more stats that'll make your eyes roll back in your head, but it's so interesting because in America, there is an assumption, and I have had both of these things said to me even within the last year, that Muslims and or Mormons are taking over America. And if they don't mention those two, then they mention atheists. Well, listen to this. America is 300 million people, but there are only 6 million Mormons in America. Only 6 million. In fact, there are only 13 million worldwide. The thing that's drawn so much attention is not their number, but their influence. Listen to this. There are only 7 million Muslims in America out of 300 million people. And by the way, that number is high. One estimate of the number of Muslims in America is 2.5 million. But 7 million people. And then some folks would say that atheists are taking over America. But an interesting trend over this last year is showing us, of course, this is not true, and that really the balances are different than most people have thought. Only 2% of Americans describe themselves as atheists. Only 2%. So my final of the 10 faith trends of 2011, is that fear is overblown and misinformation reigns. Only 6 million Americans, only 6 million Mormons in America, only 7 million Muslims, and only 2% of our population says they're atheists. So whatever is happening in America, it's not because some religious group or anti-religious group is quote-unquote taking us over. It is instead, perhaps, that some people are exerting influence they've never exerted before, and this is inspiring fear. So those are the faith trends for 2011, and we'll be talking about this also in 2012. Faith is shaping our times, just not in the way most people think.
This Stephen Mansfield podcast was brought to you by the Mansfield Group. Find us at mansfieldgroup.com.